20 or so percent of their diets being ultra processed food actually had a 28% increased accelerated rate of cognitive decline. Now, while this was a study done in Brazil, it's important to recognize that in the United States, about 50% of our diet is ultra processed food, so this is important. But then it points to something that we also need to discuss is that while these modifiable risk factors are things that can be changed, they're things that may not be changed easily. So when it comes to the food example, if you take someone who lives in a food desert, is working 2 to 3 jobs to put food on the table for their family, they may not have the time to go to the grocery store that is far away from them to get nutritious food onto the table. So that just points to kind of the difficulty of changing some of these modifiable risk factors. And another very exciting study that we heard about was the EXERT trial. This is a trial that looked at exercise and how that may reduce the risk, how quickly people progress when they begin to have cognitive decline. Now, this was a 12-month trial that was done during the pandemic, and they had 2 arms. One was the aerobic exercise arm where you get your heart rate up, and the second was more kind of like stretching exercises, so things like yoga, and as well as people who just did not do any exercise at all. Now, what they found was that in both the people who had the aerobic exercise as well as the people who even did the stretching, their decline, the rate of cognitive decline was less, pointing to the importance of exercise. Now, the big question that we all want to answer then is there a combination of these lifestyle factors that we can target to reduce a person's overall risk of getting cognitive decline? Now, that's what the Alzheimer's Association is hoping to answer as part of the U.S. Pointer study. So the U.S. Pointer study is a 2-year lifestyle intervention trial. So this is looking at individuals who are at risk of, older individuals who are at risk of developing dementia. So may have obesity, may have like a family history. And they're looking at a couple of domains, looking at diet, exercise, social engagement, as well as health monitoring, cognitive engagement, to see if that will reduce the risk of developing cognitive decline. This is being done in 5 geographically diverse U.S. sites, and that is an important aspect of this because the original study that was done in Finland, called the Finger study, but that was done in a homogeneous population. And we want to make sure that these recommendations that we come up with, the changes to diet, whatnot, are applicable across communities, not to just some individuals. Now, the trial had a recruitment target of 2,000 individuals, and it is about 88% recruited, which is fantastic to hear. Now, also for the first time in our field, really, they have about 30% of the individuals in that trial being from underrepresented backgrounds, and that is in part due to some of the methods of recruitment that they put in place, such as faith-based recruitment methods to reach these hard-to-reach populations. And while the parent study was started by the Alzheimer's Association with $35 million, this other agencies such as the NIH have given additional funding to make this a $100 million study. And some of the additional studies that have been tacked onto the U.S. Pointer study are looking at things like sleep, which we know is absolutely critical for changing a person's risk for getting several different health conditions. They're looking at imaging as well. They're also looking at changes to the blood vessels around the brain and changes to the interactions between like the bacteria in your gut and how that may affect the brain as well. Now, to switch gears a little bit and talk about what is happening on the treatment landscape. Yes, go ahead. Please.
I think what you just described is critically important because, as you pointed out, for a disease that could be developing over 2 or maybe longer decades, it almost seems like it's such a high bar to think that at that point any treatment is going to be able to be really effective to go in and undo all of what's happened over so many years of putting all these processes in place. But I guess it's my sense, and I would love to get your thoughts, that the U.S. healthcare system is still not where it needs to be in terms of valuing prevention, whether it be for Alzheimer's, for cancer, diabetes. You could fill in the blank with almost any chronic disease. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts from where you sit as to whether or not you think the tide is changing, and if it's not, what can foundations like the Alzheimer's Association do? What can patient advocacy groups do? Because to me, until we get past that impediment, even the best data from the best run clinical trials, if there's no reimbursement, if there's no thought to prevention, then we're sort of stuck.
So I think the tide is turning, at least for Alzheimer's disease. I think the tide is turning, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And this is partially because of our efforts in advocacy. That's something that you can do as advocate. Talk to your senators, talk to people on the Hill, because they are the people who have the ability to make real change. But another example in terms of us thinking about prevention and risk reduction is that the Alzheimer's Association also received a grant from the CDC and was designated one of the bold centers for risk reduction, where we're going to systematically study look at the different risk factors and see which ones can be implemented early and which ones have what different levels of evidence around them. Because a lot of the evidence that we have are from epidemiological studies. So we want to see what the strength of the evidence is and what we can implement from a public health perspective to reduce that overall risk. Because you're absolutely right. At some point, the train has left the station, and you can't change it when that happens. These are brain cells. These brain cells, they don't divide anymore. So once they're gone forever. So so we want to stop them from dying in the first place. And I think that message is being heard more and more with some of the efforts that we're seeing in the field. Yeah. So I want to talk really quickly about some of the treatments coming down the pipeline. And I just want to talk about the different phases of clinical trials just to provide context for the discussion that we're going to be having. So when someone is coming up with a drug, the first kind of phase is called the preclinical phase. So this is research that is done in academic labs, and that kind of looks at models like cells and animal models to come up with some candidates that they then proceed to test in humans, because cells and animals are different from humans. So then they test those in the phase 1 clinical trials. These are typically smaller trials that take a couple of months, maybe 10 to 50 or so people, and they're testing for safety. They want to make sure that there are no glaring side effects that they did not find in their model systems. The phase 2 clinical trials are larger. These take a few years to happen, and they test for safety and optimize the dose of whatever treatment that they're going to implement. And then we go on to the larger phase 3 clinical trials. These provide the chief evidence for the chief evidence that is presented to the governmental agencies for approval. Now these are typically thousands of people, hundreds to thousands of people depending on the condition, and they can take anywhere from years to decades. So that's how long the process takes before you have to get to the FDA, before these drugs come to the market. So for the longest time, Alois Alzheimer described the disease in 1906. Between 1906 and 1996, we did not have any treatments for Alzheimer's disease. But then we got the so-called symptomatic treatments. These are treatments that look at that target the symptoms of the disease. So what we like to think of it as is if you've got two brain cells that are trying to talk to each other, at some point the volume goes down. But so these symptomatic treatments try to increase the volume so that they can hear each other better. But all the time when they're trying to increase the volume, they're doing nothing to stop the death of these brain cells. So if you're speaking loudly and there's no one on the other end to hear it, then your drug's not going to work. So what we want are these disease-modifying therapies or therapies that target the underlying biology of the disease. Now, for the longest time, we'd had several trials, and there are a lot of trials that were unsuccessful. But last year we had the accelerated approval for the first drug that targets the underlying biology of the disease. This drug was called aducanumab or Aduhelm, and regardless of what side of the controversy that you sit on, this represented tremendous progress in our field to be able to get a drug through the door at the FDA. And at the time, we said that would revitalize the field, and that is exactly what we're seeing today. So in the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to get the readouts for three, maybe four other programs of drugs that also target the amyloid that I talked about earlier. Now, we've already heard the top line results from a drug called lecanemab. Lecanemab is another anti-amyloid drug. It targets a slightly different version of the amyloid. And what we heard on September 27th was that the drug was associated with a 27% reduction in cognitive decline. Now, these are just the top line results. So we're going to hear more at a conference in San Francisco later this month. What they also talked about in those top line results was that they hit both their primary outcome measure as well as their secondary outcome measure. So having this definitively positive trial is exceptionally exciting for the field. You know, they're on January 6th, they have their the FDA is going to announce their decision by January 6th of what the approval is for the drug. So that is on the horizon, but there are other drugs too. Eli Lilly has a drug called donanemab that had shown some positive results in their phase 2 trials, as well as gantenerumab, and that is also being tested, and we're hopeful that we'll hear an announcement on the trial results any day. Now, also something that I shared with David and Laura earlier today is that there's also work being done to look at different mechanisms of administration, because a lot of these drugs are currently IV infusions, and they take time to get to the clinic and get that IV infusion done. But now people are looking more at subcutaneous injections and even oral drugs that are all in development to increase the accessibility of these drugs to people. Now, I've talked a lot about anti-amyloid drugs, but that's not all that we're studying right now. They're the furthest along just because, amyloid was first described by Alois Alzheimer. We've been studying that for a really long time. But there are other drugs that are following closely behind it. And as the Alzheimer's Association, we are committed to accelerating all of the efforts that are aimed at producing effective drugs for people. And an example is through our Part the Cloud program. Now, this is a funding mechanism that provides funding looking for for scientists who are looking at other mechanisms of the disease. So think the inflammation, the changes to how the brain cells use energy, even some of the changes that happen with the vasculature and the blood vessels around the brain. So all of that is interesting and important, but one of the most exciting things that we have coming down the pipeline as well is ALZNet. Now, ALZNet is a treatment registry that was launched by the Alzheimer's Association. We are in a new phase of treatment, care, and research for Alzheimer's disease. We're no longer looking at just symptomatic treatments. We're talking also about disease modifying therapies. And all of these have been tested in highly regulated clinical trial environments. We need to understand how these drugs are going to perform in the real world. And having registries such as ALZNet have been applied in other conditions such as cancer and heart disease to track the performance of these drugs in the real world. So the Alzheimer's Association launched ALZNet about a year or so ago to track the performance of these drugs in the real world. It will also provide a platform for education for doctors in terms of how to apply these drugs, also address some of the gaps that exist in the field. Now, with all of that, I hope that I've been able to communicate to you some of the exciting updates that are happening in our field today. I want to make sure that I leave some time for your questions, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the incredible progress that is going on, and just say a big thank you for all that you do every day to help move our mission forward so that one day we'll see a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Fire away.
Yeah, any question? Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned about the research outside of the sort of the amyloid tau beta group. I've read that some of those researchers are frustrated because if you're not in that group, you can't get funding. Can the Alzheimer's Association direct funding, or?
So the Part the Cloud program is targeted to specifically to those researchers. So we have about 60 or so projects that are in there, and out of that, I think only about 2 of them are looking at amyloid. Like the rest are looking at different mechanisms.
That's
So
good.
examples that I was talking about earlier today is one thing that we know that really speeds up the drug development process is taking a drug that has been applied in a different field, say cancer or diabetes or something, and then seeing if that may have some effects based on the biological evidence that already exists in Alzheimer's disease. And some of those are actually being tested through the Part the Cloud program. So as we said, we're committed to lifting all boats because it's important for people to have options. And we want to get to a point where we have several options available and get to that precision medicine approach. So, yes, most people probably will have amyloid in their brain, but if we get to the point where we have tools for screening people to see if, the change in inflammation in, say, my brain might not be as much as, the change in inflammation in someone else's brain. So if we want to apply a drug there that will provide the most benefit, we want to apply the inflammation drug to me, but maybe we'll use a drug that changes how the brain uses energy to someone else who might have that as a bigger part of the disease biology in them. So to have precision medicine, we need several options. But to get to the best in class, we need the first in class. And the first in class are some of these anti-amyloid drugs. The first drugs in any disease are probably not going to be the best, but they're going to be something that provide hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How large is the overall funding for the Part the Cloud effort?
I believe it's about 65 million, Laura?
65 million.
Yeah.
We recently had like a $30 million matching campaign with that because Gates Ventures, Bill Gates had put forward a big chunk of investment, and we were able to match that pretty well, which was great. Yeah.
Yes.
I read an article a couple weeks ago, I think it was on NPR or online, but they were a bit critical of some of the drugs that you've mentioned and lecanemab, but they also, the caveat said that some of those drugs might be, I guess their proposition was effective if they get to people that are at risk before they even start developing, plaques and whatnot. So is there anything happening that you know of right now to identify, like, we all hear about like genetic testing for other diseases, that they were proposing that if people in their 20s were studied and they begin taking the medication before they develop it, that would be potentially more profound.
So actually related to that, I didn't have time to talk about this, but There's a large study being run out of Washington University in St. Louis called the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network. So people who have dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease, their parents have specific mutations that are deterministic. So if their parents got Alzheimer's at say age 45, they know they're going to get Alzheimer's at age 45. And this is a cohort that is allowing us to do the kinds of studies that you're talking about. And we provided funding for that study as well to accelerate it by about 3 years or so. And some of the drugs that I talked about, like lecanemab and others, are being tested in that cohort as well to see if it will slow down the progression of the disease in those individuals. Another example of this is the AHEAD 345 study, which we also fund. They're looking at individuals who have amyloid in their brain, but have not started to show cognitive symptoms yet. And they're applying some of these drugs, lecanemab and others, to see if that will also slow down the rate of developing cognitive decline. Now, again, you might be asking the question, why don't we just give these drugs to everyone? Since we know that the disease process starts about 20 or so years before clinical symptoms start to show up. These drugs are not without their side effects, and that's important for us to talk about. So one huge side effect that actually the Alzheimer's Association convened a group to describe is known as ARIA, which is amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. So what happens is that the brain is kept under in kind of a blanket called the blood-brain barrier. You can exchange things across it, but it's a very, very tight blanket around the brain. So what happens when these drugs are getting the amyloid out of the brain is that barrier becomes a little bit leaky, and so while you're pushing things out, things can go in as well, and that can lead to increased fluid in the brain in areas that it's not supposed to be in. So that's a potential side effect that you may have heard about a lot in the news. Now, while ARIA is mostly symptomatic, there are rare cases where it can be pretty serious. So we want to study this to see who has the potential to get the most benefit out of these kinds of drugs. But the efforts to start applying these drugs earlier are ongoing, just to answer your question. Yes?
Came in a little late.
Yeah.
Sorry, but I have two questions.
Yes.
One is, I've seen several studies, which I brought to Ellen's attention, showing a direct link between vitamin D deficiency and dementia. I didn't differentiate within dementia. And in fact, one article indicated that potentially this could reduce, prevent dementia in 17% of the population. And another one in the UK said that supplementation could, early enough, could reduce the population by 40%. Now, I have been taking vitamin D for many years because of osteopenia, which then became osteoporosis. Now, there's a big thing now. I saw it in the New York Times. It said there's really no, apparently clinical evidence. So I'm assuming a lot of people who are taking vitamin D are going to stop taking vitamin D. The other thing is, given COVID, a lot of people, including myself, were inside, didn't get any of the effects of vitamin D from sunshine for almost 2 years. I'm assuming this affected lots of people. So that's the one question. It doesn't seem to be, if there is indeed a link like that, it doesn't seem to be filtering out either to my internist or my endocrinologist, both of which are involved with my vitamin D. My second question, if that's not enough, my second question is, I heard in a TED Talk of a woman who's associated with a group around MIT that the use of some form of light therapy, I'm not sure it's strobe or something like light therapy, on a day-by-day basis, it does not apparently indicate anything lasting, actually affected cognitive behavior, I'm not sure about mood, And I haven't seen anything more about that. That TED Talk was several years ago. So those are two questions, really dealing with prevention and also the effect on behavior.
Yeah, I'll start with your second question.
Okay.
I think the woman you're talking about is Li Wei Sai. She's the founder of Cognito Therapeutics, and what they found is that I think it was 40 hertz magnetic stimulation showed some effects on a small group of individuals. This is still being studied, so rest assured that is still something that is under active investigation. But again, with kind of the pathway that I described for getting something through the FDA, you need larger sample sizes. You need to prove that the effect is consistent across several different people before you can get that through.
Are
to the
large
FDA.
trials in effect at this point?
Again, with the company, it's a biotech, it's a private biotech company. Their business decisions are outside our control. But we've seen that data, and again, promising. And we also would advocate for non-pharmacological interventions just to reduce the risk of some of these side effects that we talked about. So there's no real preference to any specific mechanism or pathway. We want everything to work so that people have options. And then in the future, it's probably going to be a combination of some of these pharmacological interventions as well as some of these other treatments that may not even enter the body. So that's the first question. As to the second question having to do with COVID, we found that COVID, and I'll get to the vitamin D piece in a little bit, we found that the isolation from COVID actually does accelerate some of the cognitive symptoms. Mm-hmm. So, it's not just the fact that they were not getting sunlight, but also the isolation from people. That's why one of the domains being tested in the U.S. Pointer study is social engagement, to see what that effect is. Now, for vitamin D, for a disease as complex as Alzheimer's disease and all of the different things that are affected, potentially no one thing is going to be the one treatment or the one supplement that will change the disease process. If vitamin D just so happens to be one of the things that is part of a lifestyle recipe that needs to be changed, sure. But a lot of what those studies that you sent are looking at are associations. Now, these associations will come about if you have a large enough sample of people. You will get associations in a lot of things. But association and correlation do not prove causation. What we need is to prove causation and to see how best to apply, the different aspects of things, different supplements, different treatments, different risk reduction strategies to overall benefit a person who may be at risk of developing cognitive decline.
I guess, let me just.
Yes, please.
Scientist,
Yes.
This is a lay, just, reading the articles that I saw that I gave to Ellen were very definitive in saying that there was a causal relation. It wasn't just a correlation. There was a causal relationship. And the second thing is, what could it hurt if once a year, one would take when you're going for your physical, that they take a vitamin D level, and if it's too low, what could it hurt, given that there's already now, a body of evidence indicating let's call it at least a likely relationship. What could hurt? It's vitamin D. It's not, unless it's you do too much. It couldn't hurt.
So therein lies the danger of with any form of supplementation, having conversations with your physician is critical, because what could happen is that, sure, I'm going to be taking this vitamin every single day, and then all of a sudden I have a heart attack, and then I need actual medication that's life-saving, but the drug-drug interactions between the vitamin D or whatever supplement that I have in my body prevents me from taking that life-saving medication. So it's not as linear as we would like to think, because because we need to have balanced levels of so many different things in our bodies. So artificially elevating one may not be the way to go. And that's why the conversation with your physician to make sure it's personalized is important before you take any form of supplementation. I show my doctor my Central that I take in the morning, just so that he makes sure that it's okay for me to take.
But if you don't go, if there's a statistical level of adequate vitamin D, and you're at that level, how could it hurt?
We all have different bodies. We all have different bodies. You know, how the levels that you will have in your blood from taking the same vitamin D pill will be different from the levels that I will have based on my activity level,
Right.
what I eat, what else I'm doing. So you want to make sure that this is a personalized conversation, and that's why we can't prescribe that across the board, just based on the differences in people and what their medical situation would be.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yes, question.
One question, going back to the social isolation piece, are they studying the difference between, the different impact between virtual socialization versus in-person socialization? Because I know that's, like, as we move back out of pandemic, there's still a lot. I have a mother who's 88, lives in New York, so we connect with her on Zoom, but I don't feel like it's the same kind of thing, and I'm just curious whether study is being done on that.
Actually, so at AIC, this past year, I want to say, one of the things that they found was even just texting or talking to your friends on the phone actually was provided some kind of buffer against the negative impact, the negative cognitive impacts of COVID-19. But again, we need to study this more and more as time goes on. I like to also remind people that COVID-19 has been here for only 2 years, and we're only beginning to understand that. And that's part of what is being studied in the Alzheimer's Association SARS-CoV-2 International Consortium. This is a consortium of with over 40 different countries, and we're receiving technical guidance from the World Health Organization to understand the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on the brain. So we're just in the beginning stages of our understanding of the disease, but that's something that I think people have definitely looked into as well. Yes.
What's your speculation on the FDA's position on lecanemab? And is it likely to meet with the same controversy as aducanumab?
I don't like to speculate. The second you said that, I was like, ooh.
But it feels like the data is a little bit more encouraging.
So we don't have the full set of data, and that's what we're going to find out later on this month. So I don't want to speculate on anything, and I don't want to also speculate on what happens in regulatory agencies. That's just beyond my knowledge to talk about. But I'm encouraged based on the top line results, because this is the first time that we've had both positive primary and secondary outcome measures, and also a decent slowing of cognitive decline. But it does point to something that I think Dr. Frazier, Dr. Frazier talked about earlier on today, is that we need to set our expectations appropriately for these drugs. You're targeting something that has been going on in the brain for 20 years or so. This is not going to be a silver bullet that cures the disease. This is going to be something that is going to be part of a regimen, part of combination therapy to provide the maximum benefit. So we need to think about that too when we think about, the potential importance of these drugs. Yes.
When you were talking about the risk factors and risk reduction, kind of what you described, especially about the things that you can control and you can change, are just to me like so general guides for general good health. And you do that, then you lower the risk for high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and all of that. I'm just wondering if there's anything further that you would say would be a highlightable risk reduction factor, particularly for Alzheimer's.
So that's what is being studied as part of the Bold Center for Risk Reduction at the Alzheimer's Association, to find those like the most important ones. But what I will tell you though is that what is good for the heart is good for the brain.
Okay.
That is just what we're finding out. So all of these things that you probably picked up on are also very good for the heart, and we want to kind of keep that heart health, that heart mind connection or heart brain connection healthy, to reduce that risk of developing cognitive decline over time as we age. But yes, it's under active investigation.
Can I ask a question to Michael? So
Yeah.
Michael's a cardiologist.
Yes.
So when you meet with cardiac surgeons,
Let's say it.
cardiac surgeons are a little bit different. But are cardiologists talking to their patients, and when they're telling them about all the heart health stuff, to also that your brain health goes with it, or is it always doing on the heart and not, and also your brain?
I'm not sure how many people go to that length to explain to the patient why it's good for them to do such and such a thing, but to Claire's point earlier, now it's almost mandated that you're doing all these preventative things. They're part of the electronic medical record. You can't escape the page and sign your name until you've done smoking cessation and talked about exercise and diet and all of those things. So it's getting more, there's more prevention built into the system, and I think there's even some Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement based on that.
Learn something new.
Research is typically targeted and has to be pretty controlled, but are there any studies happening that are in partnership with other, diseases that isn't not as siloed? Like, for example, we're studying a large group of people, but we're looking for several things that we already know seem to have some relationship in terms of prevention.
I think it's coming to mind actually.
Well, I mean, if you think about the New Idea Study, we are partnering with the American Academy of Radiology.
Yeah.
So that's radiologists.
Yeah.
We think of other ones.
Yeah.
I could probably come up with one or two,
Yeah.
like within the grants program.
Yeah, but so something along those lines is the repurposing of drugs that I talked about. Is that, you know, these are drugs that have been tested in other conditions and may have an impact for Alzheimer's disease. So something along those lines, but nothing is immediately coming to mind. Yeah.
But I mean, I will say that a lot of the meetings that we do on the, with the NIH, those are interdisciplinary for the most
Yes.
part. So we are,
Yes.
it's not like we're talking just
Yes.
to,
Yes.
people in the neurospace and the Alzheimer's
Yes.
space.
Yes.
We are having conversations with people well outside of the field,
Yeah.
to figure out where there are points of collaboration.
And an example was at our Addressing Health Disparities conference. Health disparities is something that has been talked about in all fields, because, underrepresentation is not just something that is germane to Alzheimer's disease. And on the panel that we had at the end of the day, it had representation from the Michael J. Fox Foundation. We had the American Heart Association, the Alzheimer's Association, and the NIH to talk about these issues. So we're definitely doing that, but just thinking of specific clinical trials that I would have to dig into grants
We have one with
portfolios.
the Michael J. Fox Foundation.
Oh, you have? There you go.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's Cure One, Cure Many is the title of the study itself, and it's basically trying to find biomarkers
Yeah.
for Lewy body dementia.
Yeah.
So it's a different kind of prevention, but at the same time, Parkinson's is under that umbrella, and it'll affect not only dementia generally, but it also helps Parkinson's patients. It's all said and done.
We had an excellent presentation on Saturday on health disparities in a relationship with our African American Community Forum, and some of the things that came out of that were really, very eye-opening, I think, to the audience as well. But talking about the food deserts, talking about the thing, and help me with his name, the medical director for Baltimore County.
Oh, Dr. Branch.
Yeah, Dr. Branch was amazing, and one of the things that he was talking to these folks about was even as early as when the diet of an infant, that they're not necessarily being encouraged to breastfeed because they're being given a can of Similac or Enfamil on the way out the door. And yet, if they were more encouraged to start the child's diet off with the perfect formula, whenever possible, meaning the mother's formula, that's going to start them on a trail for better diet. And he talked a lot about the same kinds of things you talked about with the food deserts and not being able to get the food. And the one line that he gave, which I thought was just brilliant, was he said when he's faced with patients that would say, well, diabetes runs in my family, and his comment was, yes, because running doesn't run in your family. So that and I thought that was just perfect, that idea of that the physical and the exercise and those kind of things. And it was the room erupted with laughter, like this group, but it was, here he is speaking as an African American man and doctor and saying, yeah, this is some of the things. It was just a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, but you also bring up an important point of the life course perspective, and thinking about these different risk factors at different points in people's lives. So we know that early on things like education are important, but as people continue to age, obesity, smoking, diabetes, midlife diabetes are kind of the bigger things. And if you look at the Lancet Commission's report in 2020, the one where they said about 40% or so of all of these dementia cases can be eliminated in the world if you targeted modifiable risk factors, that's exactly what they were looking at. It's just not a static picture. We need to consider people's life course perspective. And the story out of AAIC that was talking about access to socioeconomic status and how that relates to dementia risk, they found that even based on your parents' income levels, that might reduce your risk of getting cognitive decline later in life. So we need to think about first intergenerationally, but also from a life course perspective. And it's I'm glad that was brought up at your conference on Saturday.
Question.
Yes.
So my mom's been gone for 8 years now, but for 10 years I was her primary caregiver. And back then, she was taking a drug called Namenda. She was taking a drug called Aricept. Like, are they still around and like being used? And what is what?
Yes. So
Okay.
that's important for us to talk about. Those are the symptomatic treatments that also I referenced
Not the
earlier
causal.
on. Yes, those are the symptomatic treatments. But it's important that we keep advancing those as well, because even if we're reducing the rate at which people are developing cognitive decline, people are still going to develop cognitive decline, and we need to have treatments for people when they do get to those stages, because those drugs are typically for moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease, and all of these or severe dementia due to Alzheimer's disease, and all of the drugs that I talked about, the disease modifying therapies are targeting the earliest stages of the disease, or have been studied in the earliest stages of the disease. So mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease, as well as mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. These have not been tested in the later stages of the disease. So we need options for that stage as well. So yes, they're there. Yes, they're important. And we need to continue working on those kinds of therapies as well.
You can't turn on the TV now without getting the commercials for, what is it, Prevacent?
Oh, Prevagen.
Prevagen and all that. And so people do ask us, do they work? Do they help? And I'm like, I'm not a scientist or pharmacist, so you might need to ask your doctor. But do they? Is there any? Because boy, they're making a lot of money on them.
So those kinds of things have not been tested in the gold standard, that is large-scale controlled clinical trials, to provide evidence that this works in a large population of people. So again, we can't recommend them because the evidence is not there, right? If even when we're thinking about risk reduction strategies, we're testing it in a large-scale controlled clinical trial in U.S. Pointer. So that is the barrier. That's the standard that you need to meet to become a drug that can be recommended in that fashion. Or a supplementation. That has not been tested in that way, so we can't recommend it.
Listen to the end of the commercial. Does not prevent, treat, or cure.
There we go. There we go.
It's a very low
That's how you know it's not
There we
tested.
go.
Yeah. And we learned like when in early training, I remember that, you know, something can say clinically tested in like the first stage that proved it didn't kill anybody.
Yeah.
But it didn't
Yes.
necessarily prove that it worked.
That's the phase 1 clinical trials that I
Right.
talked about. Going through safety. Yeah.
But it's clinically tested.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then what?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Questions?
All right, well, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Griffin. I would just like to say how grateful we are to have you here today, to be able to
grateful
speak
to
to
be
this
here.
great audience. And I also want to extend my thanks to all of you. Everyone here is an important partner in the Alzheimer's Association, and we're very grateful for everything you do. So feel free to hang out. We've still got some food, cookies. You can dance on the dance floor because we still don't have our furniture out there. But again, thanks for being here, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Claire got some